Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Rainbow Climate Change podcast. If you're new here, please check out our previous episodes. Today, I'm going to be talking about the effect of climate change on drought and floods. I'm your host, Malikia. Climate change increases the frequency and intensity of floods, but you might be wondering how climate change is associated with floods. Well, as climate change warms up the atmosphere, the air can hold 7% more vapor for every 1 degree rise in temperature. When this air rapidly cools, water vapor turns into droplets, which join together to form heavy rainfall. For countries who are used to high water levels, they may be more equipped to these conditions, and so the effect of flooding is minimized. But other countries that are not adapted to heavy rainfall are more vulnerable to dangerous flooding. The increase in temperature due to climate change is also leading to melting of ice caps. This poses significant effect to coastal towns and cities as they will continue to be overwhelmed by rising seas, which will lead to cost of repairing damaged infrastructure. In fact, Antarctica has lost about 3 trillion tons of ice in the last 25 years, causing global seas to rise by 8 millimeters. In the future, sea levels could rise as much as 5 meters. We talked about sea level rise in our third episode, so feel free to check that out if you haven't already, of course. But why? Well, as I said earlier, when glaciers melt, sea levels rise. This increases the amount of water flow to the river basin. With more melted water, the risk of flooding downstream increases. In Central Asia, glaciers are decreased by 16 meters every year in mass, volume, and length. But now that I've talked all about flooding, let me talk now about drought. Climate change leads to extreme drought because it leads to warmer temperatures, which enhance evaporation, which reduces surface water and dries out soils and vegetation. This makes periods with low precipitation drier than they would be in cooler conditions. But aside from that, drought also over the last century has led to extreme rainfall shocks, which is basically below average rain, and they have actually increased by 233% in certain regions. But the places where dry shocks are happening actually depends on geographic location and income. Poor countries that are typically in arid and semi-arid regions experience more dry shocks and are more vulnerable to these shocks. In Somalia, for example, rainfall in the 2022 March to May season was the lowest in the last 6 decades. Parts of Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda have also experienced very dry conditions compared with the average. Extreme drought also poses harm to economic growth of developing countries. Compared to normal conditions, moderate drought reduces growth in developing countries, on average by about 0.39 percentage points, while extreme drought reduces growth by about 0.85 percentage points. This leads to reduced crop yields and decreased food. Drought can also widen the poor-rich gap in low and middle-income countries, with significant and long-term impacts on firms, and families. A dry shock in the first 1,000 days of a child's life can affect their future prospects. In rural Africa, women born during severe droughts grow up physically shorter, receive less education, and ultimately become less wealthy. This could be because there's no money, available for their children due to their farms not performing well. Because most people living in rural areas depend on the food from farming to survive, whether that's them eating it themselves or also using it to get some money to pay for their children's school fees. So because the crops are not performing well, it's really hard for them even to eat. They wouldn't spend money to go to school if they don't have enough money to spend to eat food. But you might be also curious about how drought leads to farms not performing well. Farms don't perform well due to extreme drought because, as I mentioned earlier, extreme drought leads to dry soils and periods where precipitation is low and drier. This affects crop yields and reduces livestock production. Also, if the drought persists, farmers may be forced to abandon certain crop types, sell off parts of their herds, ultimately impacting food insecurity and farm availability. So now that I've talked about this, I would like you to answer some questions. So I'll start with the first one, which I've just talked about now, so it should be easy. How does extreme drought lead to farms not performing well? How does extreme drought lead to farms not performing well? Hope you heard that one very well. The second one is, what does extreme drought lead to? What more does it lead to? And the last question is, how does the melting of glaciers lead to flooding? That might be a bit tricky. How does the melting of glaciers lead to flooding? I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please check out more of our episodes. Bye bye.